everybody, and welcome to this talk about polyglot science. My name is Xaver, and you probably have not heard of me, and if you did, it was probably because you have seen my talk at this year's Polyglot Gathering, which was about what polyglots can learn from neuroscience. And today we're going to flip the coin and see what neuroscience can learn from polyglots. Now today we are going to learn about these two lines of research, the first one being done by Kenneth Hildenstam. He is a Swedish researcher and linguist. He's really active in the field of second language acquisition and recently got involved with polyglotism. The next one would be the work done by Xaver and colleagues at MIT. And what they did is they did the first and only neuroimaging study on polyglots, and it got just published this year, so this is really hot stuff. Then in the end, I have an important announcement for all of you, so make sure to stick around. So before we dive into this, let's quickly have a look at some of the case studies that have been published in the last 40 years. And you may recognize some of them because they were featured in Michael Erad's book Babel No More. And these were the only scientific publications we had on polyglots prior to what I'm going to show you in a bit. And the first one concerns this gentleman to the right here. That's Emil Krebs. He was a German-Chinese interpreter at the beginning of last century and allegedly spoke 68 languages. And what happened to him is that his brain was conserved in a museum in a jar full of alcohol or something. And then in 2004, these researchers decided to take it out of the jar and take a slice from his Broca's area, which is an area implicated in language processing. And then they took that slice and looked at it under the microscope and compared it to slices from other regions and from other brains. And what they observed were robust differences in cytoarchitecture, which is a technical term basically referring to the cellular composition of a brain area. If you want, you can have a look at this study, but it's quite technical. Then we have 3 other case studies on here. So in this one, what was pretty interesting was how the authors related the talent their polyglot had with foreign accents to his special place in society as being kind of an outstander, or as he called himself, a maverick, because that would allow him to have kind of a more fluid identity and more easily adapt other accents. Then the last 2 studies on here both concern a so-called savant, and a savant is someone with a really talent for some specific thing. So they are really good at something specific. And these were savants for language, and most of the savants are diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and so were these 2. And that's why the authors, of course, made some connection between savantism and Asperger's syndrome and languages. So let's jump right into it and have a look at the work of Kenneth Hildenstam. Basically, what he did was to publish these 2 books, which are scientific publications where each chapter is written by another researcher talking about his studies or theories and the like. And in those, Hildenstam dedicated 2 chapters each on polyglotism, where initially he conducted a review of anecdotal accounts and the case studies that I mentioned before. And from those, he derived some assumptions about traits that he thought polyglots have in common. And to test some of those assumptions, he then conducted a short study with 10 participants. So let's have a look at what came out of Hildenstam's review of anecdotal accounts and case studies. Basically, he concluded that polyglots can be assumed to have any of these 6 traits, and I suggest we go through them one by one to see what he actually meant. So first up is a high language learning aptitude and awareness. And this notion of language learning aptitude is basically referring to how well a person can take up new language material. And this can be assessed with some tests that we will have a look on in a bit. And also, when this notion was first conceived back in the 50s, it was supposed to be an innate trait, so something that you're born with, or you could think of as a language talent. But this has since been challenged quite a bit, so it is not at all obvious that this is a talent or something. But it seems to be quite a stable trait. So if you test the same person 2 years apart, the results will be pretty similar. Next up, we have a strong and specific type of motivation. And I think you can pretty much resonate with this. And maybe you also resonate with the next point, being a high level of learner autonomy, which of course refers to the observation that Hittenstam made that a lot of polyglots do not seek out classic language classes or stuff like that, but rather take their learning journey on by themselves. Next up, we would have a good general cognitive functioning. This basically relates to stuff like working memory or pattern recognition. And then a high systemizing ability. Systemizing ability basically refers to the ability or the drive to derive some rules that underlie a given system. Hittenstam thought that this was the case for polyglots because language as well is kind of this system that has some underlying rules that you can learn about and then derive some insight from that. And lastly, we have the ability to perceive sensory detail. And this, of course, is mainly referring to sound. So, for example, if you have phonemes, Hittenstam proposed that polyglots should be pretty good in distinguishing different phonemes, for example. And all of the traits that are surrounded by a red box here are the ones that Hittenstam was about to assess in his short study with 10 polyglots. So for this little study, he recruited 10 participants, and on this slide you can see the number of foreign languages, as well as their self-reported proficiency at each of those languages. And one important thing to note about them is that 9 of those participants were male, which is kind of a problem because, first of all, it's not a really representative sample of polyglots. And in one of those experiments that he's about to do, this also poses quite a problem, which we'll see in a bit. So the first experiment that Hittenstam did with these 10 participants was comprised of the so-called llama tests. And these are basically used to assess the language learning aptitude of someone. What you can see here on the slide is one of the 4 subsections of the test, namely the B subsection about vocabulary learning. And what you have to do here is you have this grid of objects, and then with your mouse you hover over the objects and then try to remember the associated words. And after like a minute or two, you then get tested on this, as you can see to the right. And that's basically the subsection. And these tests are supposed to be language independent because, for one, they use these picture stimuli, and then also the verbal material that is used is from indigenous languages from Central America and British Columbia, so that the test takers do not necessarily know any of the material beforehand because these languages are so small. If you want to try it out for yourself, you can go to this URL down here and see how you do. So another subsection that I quickly wanted to show you is this F subsection about grammatical inferencing. And in this you have these red boxes that you click, and for each box you get a picture and a text that goes along with it. And you then are supposed to derive some underlying rules from these text and pictures that you then apply in the testing part to the right. And there are 2 other subsections. One of them is about associations between symbols and sounds. So you have like an invented script, and then you press on one of the letters and then you hear a sound. And then you go on learning for 1 or 2 minutes and then you get tested on it. The last subsection, in that you hear an audio file of different sentences, and they may be repeating, so you may have heard a sentence before, and you basically just indicate if you've heard it before or not. So this is kind of a sound pattern recognition test. So now let's have a look at how polyglots did on this assessment. So in this table, in the leftmost column, you have some initials that indicate the different participants. And then for each subsection, you have a column with the corresponding scores down here. Note that there's another subsection from another test that was included to complement the F subsection on grammatical inferencing. And the scores range from 0 to 100, except for the D subsection where they range from 0 to 75. And in addition to indicating a score on this table, there are also these ranges, outstanding, good, average, and poor, which are just to further categorize the results. And if we take a look at this, we mostly see outstanding results, if not then good, and there are only 4 averages and 1 poor result. So this seems pretty good. Our polyglots did pretty well on this test. And Hittenstam said that this is an unprecedented language learning aptitude that was observed here. And this goes back to the fact that there has not been any group of people tested on this test so far that scored as high as these polyglots, with 33 out of 50 measures in the outstanding range. Furthermore, note that in the test manual, it is stated that to score in the outstanding range, it takes analytical linguists in any of the subsections. So our polyglots are head-to-head with analytical linguists. And a normal person would score around 50. One thing that you might have noticed is that it seems that the polyglots are not doing that well on the D subsection. And this is interesting because the D subsection is the only one where you are not given some time to study. It's a subsection where you just listen to some skits of audio material and you have to indicate whether you heard any of these skits before or not, and they may be repeating. Apparently this is really the only subsection where the ability to implicitly learn is really important. And for the other subsections, you can learn with an explicit strategy because you have these 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes where you can just study the material. And from that, Hittenstam basically concluded that polyglots combine a great explicit learning strategy with an above average ability for implicit learning, as indicated on the D subsections, where the polyglots still scored above average. Next up, Hittenstam tried to assess the motivation of his participants by conducting some interviews. And what he found out was basically that the motivation of the participants varied to some extent, but was extremely high for all of them. Also, he found that they were strongly committed to language learning, saying things like, it's a necessity, or my only hobby, or even what makes life worthwhile. And apart from that, he noted that the polyglots were interested in language structure and sound specifically, and also emphasized the use of language as a tool for communication, meaning that they also sought out conversation with native speakers pretty early in their studies, compared to people that are in traditional language classes. Now lastly, Hittenstam measured the systemizing ability of his participants, and he did that by using a questionnaire called the Systemizing Empathizing Quotient. And basically, as I said before, what systemizing is the drive or the ability to derive some underlying rules from a system. And empathizing, on the other hand, is the ability to really understand other people's thoughts and emotions and then to act accordingly. And this test basically is comprised of 2 parts, A and B, one for the systemizing part and the other one for the empathizing part. And there you have these statements, and you have to indicate if you strongly agree a little bit, disagree a little bit, or strongly disagree. So for example, if we take the first item, when I listen to a piece of music, I always notice the way it's structured. So somebody that is high on systemizing would say he strongly agrees with this, and somebody who is low on systemizing would strongly disagree. As we can also take an example from the empathizing quotient. So for example, I can easily tell if somebody wants to enter a conversation. And somebody who is really high in empathizing would say, yes, I strongly agree. And somebody who is low in empathizing would say, I strongly disagree. And if you want, you can also take this test, just go to the URL down here and have fun with it. So let's have a look at the results of this experiment, which are summarized in this graph. So on the y-axis, you have the empathizing score, meaning the higher you are in this graph, the more of an empathizer you are. On the right, you have the systemizing score, meaning the higher you are on systemizing, the more to the right you would be on this graph. And then, depending where you fall, you also have these shades of gray, which categorize you into different types. For example, extreme type E, if you would fall somewhere in this range, would indicate that you are a really extreme empathizer. You have a really high empathizing ability and a pretty low systemizing ability. And on the other hand, if you would fall here, maybe you're balanced, you have equal amounts of empathizing and systemizing ability. If you would fall down here, you would be the extreme type S, so extreme systemizer. And furthermore, we have these black boxes in this graph, and these indicate where the average population would fall. The F indicates where an average female would fall on this graph. So if you take 100 women and make them do these tests, and then you average out the results, you would get the results somewhere around here. So this would be a little bit low on systemizing and a little bit higher in empathizing. On the other hand, if you do this with men, they would fall around here on average. And if you do this with people with Asperger's syndrome, they would fall around here. So they would be really low in empathizing and really high in systemizing. Now you may be wondering why this indication of Asperger's syndrome is even on this graph. And this is because this test actually comes from autism research. Actually, the person that developed this test, called Simon Baron-Cohen, I think, he was one of the authors of one of the case studies about a guy with Asperger's syndrome that had some autism and really exceptional abilities in second languages. So this is where this is coming from. Note that Hittenstam did not propose that all of the polyglots are autists or something. He just thought that they would have a high systemizing ability because language is also this kind of really kind of a system that is governed by rules, and systemizers really like these kind of systems. Anyways, let's get to the participants. They are indicated by these black crosses here. So for each cross indicates where a participant fell in the study. And what we can see that most of them are in the balanced range, and 4 of them seem to be type S, so systemizers. Personally, I don't really think these results carry too much information because, as you might remember, 9 of the 10 participants were male, so it's no wonder that they are a little bit higher in systemizing in total. And this is also what Hittenstam noticed, and basically these results are kind of inconclusive and hard to interpret. And with that, we conclude the first part of this talk, and we are ready to go on to the study done at MIT. Now, the title of this study is The Small and Efficient Language Network of Polyglots and Hyperpolyglots. It was authored by Olesya Joavlev and colleagues, and the research was conducted in the lab of Evelina Fedorenko, who is the lead researcher in this group at MIT that is looking at how language is processed in the brain. And she's one of the most well-respected people in this area, and so this is really a really important publication and from a really well-respected research team. So anyways, this, as I said, is the first and only neuroimaging study done with polyglots, and it basically tries to answer the question of how do polyglots' brains differ from monolinguals while processing language. So for the study, they managed to recruit 17 polyglots, 9 of whom were male, and this is a reasonable sample size for a study like this, and also a reasonable gender ratio for representing the polyglot community. And also they used matched controls, which means that they recruited people that had the same handedness, the same socioeconomic status, and the same IQ as the polyglots. And on this slide, you can also see some of them or their language combinations. So now you might be wondering what this neuroimaging thing is that I keep mentioning. Basically, this is one of the most important and popular tools used by neuroscientists nowadays to have a look at the insides of your skull. And what happens is they put you basically in this really big scanner that has a really high magnetic field. And this can be used to generate these really beautiful pictures of your brain. And what you're looking to at the right here is a so-called anatomical scan, where we are really interested in the structure of your brain. What you can also do is the so-called functional scan. And for this, you put people in the scanner and give them some task that you're interested in. So let's say you're interested in language comprehension and therefore make them listen to sentences. Now, hopefully the regions that are implicated in language comprehension will become more active. And as brain regions get activated, they need more oxygen, and the brain therefore adapts by increasing the blood flow to these regions. That in turn is something that also can be picked up with these kind of scanners. And then using some fancy statistics, we get these beautiful activation maps where active regions are indicated by these colorful blobs. And from this, neuroscientists are then able to derive insights and refine their models. This example down here actually shows the results of a language task. And what we can see here is that there are clear activations in some of the usual suspects that we may be interested in when researching language. For example, here you have what most probably correlates to the Wernicke's area. So you have some activation there. And you also have some activation in the so-called Broca's area right here. Now, to compare the mechanisms of language processing of polyglots and monolinguals, what the authors of this study really had to do is to make the language areas of the brain light up. And for this, they devised a so-called language network localizer. And this localizer consists of two conditions, namely one activation condition, where the participants had to read sentences, and a control condition, where they had to read strings of non-words. And this control condition is really crucial for the design of this study. Now, you might be at home either thinking, what is the purpose of a control condition, or what are non-words? And please stick with me for a second on this one, as it will become clear once we see how these conditions actually look like. And for that, I want to conduct a little virtual experiment with you. So just keep looking at the screen and read along with whatever you see popping up. The dog chased the cat all day long. The closest parking spot is 3 blocks away. Boca dash he the driles le psych fristies. Cron dector dit memp fand blalk the malvite. So this is the kind of material that the participants of this study were shown while being measured in the scanner. The first 2 sentences are examples of what the activation condition looked like. So these are just regular sentences. And the box at the bottom shows you some examples from the non-word control condition. Now, these non-words are quite peculiar, as they can be pronounced yet do not carry any semantic information. And if we now subtract the activation from this control condition from the activation condition, we are left exactly with what we are interested in, namely all the areas actively involved in language comprehension. This is because since the non-words do not carry any semantic information, we suppose that brain areas involved in deriving meaning from linguistic input are not being activated by them. In other words, we get rid of anything we are not interested in. For example, if you would purely look at the activation condition without subtracting anything, you would most probably see a huge activation in the part of your brain that processes visual input, namely your visual cortex, which we are not interested here. And by subtracting the activation from the non-words condition from the activation condition, we conveniently get rid of this. So the main big insight that the researchers derived from this study is that the polyglots' language networks were smaller and less active compared to the monolingual controls. And this is illustrated nicely in this figure here, where on the left you have representations of the polyglots' brains together with their respective blobs of language network activations in yellow. And if you compare those with the controls to the right, you can clearly see that the polyglots' language network activation blobs are way smaller. And the researchers interpreted this as a processing efficiency change, possibly due to extensive linguistic experience. And what they mean by that is that as you get more experience with languages, your language network naturally becomes more and more efficient in dealing with language material. And this then leads to the language network taking up fewer neural resources, and is the reason why you see this reflected in less activations in these neuroimaging studies. And this also fits nicely with observations from research on expert skill acquisition, where you see less extensive activations in people that are experts in a given task. And apart from that, the researchers did not observe any other widespread effects of polyglotism on the brain. And what they did is they conducted more experiments and had a look at other widespread big networks in the brain. So one of these was the multiple demand network that is really related to working memory. And the other one was the default network, which is really what is active when you're not doing anything in particular, and especially when you're thinking about the past and planning for the future. So it would have been pretty interesting to see some differences in these networks, but equally not seeing any differences is also pretty interesting, because this basically means that apart from the language network, polyglots are pretty normal. With this, we have now basically covered every scientific article that has been published on polyglots up to date. But I still have another treat for you. I've been in contact with Olesa Yorablev, the author of the study we just discussed. And she was so kind to share with me some so far unpublished results from the studies done at MIT. And I'm really happy to be able to present them to you right now. First of all, they asked the question of how are multiple languages represented in polyglots' brains? Do they share the same neural substrate, or do they activate completely different regions? And to investigate this, they designed a multi-language listening task. And in this, they put people in the scanner and had them listen to speech excerpts and scrambled speech in different languages. And scrambled speech, you can think of it basically as normal speech, but all the words are mixed up, so it's not intelligible at all. And they had them listen to these two conditions, first in their native language, then in some non-native familiar languages, so these were languages that the polyglots knew, then unfamiliar cognate languages, so these were languages that the polyglots did not know, but that were cognate languages to some language that they knew. And then also to unfamiliar cognate languages, so languages that were no cognates and that the polyglots did not know. And if you then do the contrast normal speech to scrambled speech, you would get these kind of regions, which is also the language network basically. And then the researchers generated these beautiful activation maps where each point is colored according to how many languages it gets activated by. So the more yellow a point on these representations, the more languages activated. And from this, they concluded that different languages activate highly overlapping areas within the language network. So this means that it doesn't matter which language you're listening to, your language network will take care of it with more or less the same areas. And this is a really cool finding, because this is also in line with research done on bilinguals. If you look at bilingual brains, they also process both the languages they grew up with more or less the same neural substrate. So next up, the researchers used the same data to tackle the question of how language network activation sizes differed across languages. And the results are summarized in this graph here. So the height of these bars indicates the extent of the activation caused by a given language. And on the y-axis you have these different language conditions, so the native language, then some non-native familiar languages, 2 unfamiliar cognate languages, and 2 unfamiliar non-cognate languages. And what we see first of all is for the native language condition, we see a replication of the findings of the preceding study. So you really have small activation size indicating a pretty efficient language network. But then looking at the other conditions, we see quite a different pattern. So we start with a pretty big activation size for the most familiar non-native language, and that then decreases as proficiency decreases. And the way the researchers explained this is that the less you know in a language, the less you're able to extract information. So for the unfamiliar non-cognate languages, for example, there is not really any information to be extracted from there. If you then go to the unfamiliar cognate languages, you may be able to derive some words from that. So your brain is a little bit active in getting these words that are cognates. And then as you increase the proficiency, you're more and more able to get the semantics of what is being said and really the whole picture, and also what is kind of meant by reading between the lines. So you get some meaning that maybe is not that obvious from just the meaning of the words, but you really combine the intonation of the speaker and stuff like that. So to summarize, with decreasing proficiency, there's less information to be extracted from language material, and we therefore see a decrease in activity. So now, how do we go on from this? There's still a lot of questions unanswered, most prominently the question of innateness. So are any of these differences that we have seen between polyglots and monolinguals really acquired through extensive training with language material, as the researchers suggested, or could it also be that you are, for example, born with a really efficient language network and are thereby drawn to the study of languages? And to really answer this question, what we need is genetic and longitudinal studies. In genetic studies, you take a look at the DNA of people and try to figure out some genes that may be causing some trait. And in this case, we would be looking for kind of a language or a polyglot gene. And in longitudinal studies, you basically follow people for a really long time. So we would take somebody who just started learning their first foreign language and then take measures all the way up to a point where he is a polyglot or speaks some amount of languages, and see how the language network develops over time. And there are good news because the researchers have taken genetic material from all of the participants, so they will be able to answer this question in the future. And above all, we still need more data. The more data we have, the more fancy the analysis we could do, and the more clear the insights we can gain from this. So I would encourage you all to participate in some kind of research with polyglots. And now we are slowly but surely approaching the end of this talk. I would like to thank all of you for listening and staying until the end, and I hope that you found these studies as interesting as I did. To recap, we have learned how Hildenstamm discovered an unprecedented language learning aptitude and a really strong motivation in polyglots, and then saw how Joachlev and colleagues used neuroimaging to determine their small and efficient language network. Now, there's only one thing left to do, and I'm really excited about this, the big and important announcement. So the big important announcement that you've all been waiting for is that these studies that I just told you about at MIT are still going on. So there are still polyglots wanted. And if you don't have any metal plates inside of you and you're not claustrophobic, you are eligible to go into the scanner and participate in F. Fedorenko's research and do these experiments that we have talked about and some more. I don't know what they're going to do. Anyways, if you want to participate, send a mail to this mail address. And you can participate if you are somewhere in the Boston area, or you can afford to travel there, or if you're somewhere in Europe, there are also some collaborators of F. Fedorenko that are based in Europe. And with that, I wish you have a nice evening and see you sometime.